Good afternoon, Frank.
Hello, Professor Spooner.
Another week has passed, and the most interesting thing and perhaps a rather disturbing thing that has happened in the last few days, it seems to me, is the international context of the Syria conflict, in which it seems to me that Russia is supplying arms to one side, and we seem to be very close to supplying arms to the other side, which reminds me of what went on between 1945 and 1991.
Yes, we have ourselves a nice little proxy war.
However, I didn't at first think of that it was harking back to because I really think you can't turn the clocks backward. It must be different in some way. And what I thought of immediately was the fact that plenty of people now try to write world history and explain how lots of things have changed over the years. And we have David Christian's Big History, in which he puts everything in several different time frames, which is, I find, absolutely fascinating. But nobody does it in terms of what I would call geopolitics. That is, the way we see the geography of the world keeps changing. And because I started becoming aware of this before the Second World War, and then I was watching the decline of British Empire, which was changing the way we thought about the world. And then after the Second World War, during the war, we were just completely focused on Europe, and the rest of the world was only significant to the extent that it had something to do with what was going on in Europe. And then after the war, all of a sudden, we had to get used to the idea that the world was split into two camps, and you had to belong to one side or the other, even though there were a few people meeting in places like Indonesia trying to pretend they didn't belong to either side. Mm-hmm. And then we had the crisis in the 90s when we weren't sure what was happening. And at first we thought, well, we now have a unipolar world and everything radiates out from America. But it didn't take long before we realized that really wasn't explaining things for us, because all sorts of things were happening that America had no chance of controlling. So we started thinking of globalization. And globalization has been the paradigm for the way we think of the world. But most people think of globalization in terms of things spreading out from the West. Mm-hmm. And they don't take account of the fact that the way we think of the world politically is changing. So now, if you want to understand what's going on politically in the world, you have to take account certainly of China, and not just in terms of the way it relates to the American economy, but the fact that there is a struggle in the East China Sea, which we can't do anything about. We are becoming less and less able to control in the East Mediterranean. And there's a number of different parts of the world where the relationship to the larger context. Mm-hmm. And I think what's going on in Syria now needs to be seen in that context, rather than simply harking back and saying that really it's just a repeat of what we did between the 50s and the 80s. It's the fact that America's not controlling things. And there are a number of different players in the Middle East at the moment. And we can't, in fact, see it just in terms of Russia competing with America in Syria, because Europe isn't always doing exactly what America wants it to do. And Saudi Arabia and Iran certainly aren't doing always what either America or Russia want them to.
Mm-hmm. I think that it's an interesting view, because certainly back in the 50s, when there were these proxy wars going on, the result was, at least the sought-after result, it didn't usually happen, was a binary result. Either the country or what was left of it would be affiliated with the Soviet bloc, or it would be affiliated with the U.S. bloc. But I really don't think that, for example, President Obama wants to have a country that I was just going to say like the government of Baghdad, which one would think after 5,000 casualties would be associated with the American bloc, but not necessarily the case. But I really don't think the American foreign policy is aimed at having a country emerge from the Syrian conflict that is necessarily lockstep aligned with the U.S. And by the same token, I'm not so sure Putin is that interested in having a country that's lockstep aligned with Moscow as the end result. It's almost as if both sides are more than willing to simply accept the perpetuation of the status quo, but without the bloodshed. But I don't understand. I mean, I think the big history idea is the way to look at it, because I think this is a combination of little decisions. I think if the Russians hadn't seen what had happened in Iraq, if they hadn't seen what had happened in Afghanistan, they might have been empathetic to the 60,000 casualties in Syria and might be willing to pull a little harder on that or to get Assad out. But I don't think they necessarily want any Western presence that close to them in a sphere of influence that's traditionally been theirs. I mean, they still have a major naval base there.
Well, did you see I think it's the Current Economist, which has Obama on the cover?
I saw that.
Asks the question, what's his legacy going to be, and how's he going to save his, I forget what the wording is, something about how he's going to save his legacy.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the way presidents think of themselves, and he's in a mess because as far as the popular opinion in America is concerned, he's got to show that he's running the world, and he obviously isn't. He's trying to play, I think he's sensible enough to know that he can't run the world, but he's trying to both play the American public opinion on the one side and deal with the problems, international problems on the other. So he's talking to Putin, and trying to work out some sort of compromise there, but he's also talking to Erdogan, the Turkish leader, who's also in a mess because he's been supporting the rebels, and he's got a lot of people in Turkey who feel that that's not the way to go for Turkey. So there's more and more uncertainty there, and part of it, of course, has to do with the fact that nobody wants to talk to Iran.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or at least not until after the election.
Right, right. And of course, Iran's official position on Syria is keep Assad in power.
And it's difficult to see how any situation in any country now can be determined entirely according to local political feelings. The weaker the country, of course, the more important the international influences are. But it's interesting that the international influence don't seem to be affecting what goes on in Iran, which I think is something we should be taking more notice of than we do. And it's not having much effect on what goes on in Russia, but it's having a lot of effect on what goes on in each of the other countries in this drama, probably in Saudi Arabia as well.
Well, let me pose a question. All right, is it not so much that turmoil in a given country cannot occur singularly to that country, and it has to bring in many other world actors? Or is it more that the turmoil in the country is either initiated or quickly joined by that country actors? I mean, and you look at Syria, for example, very quickly, the Islamic fundamentalists had a very big role. All right, now that's like waving a red flag in front of a bull for the West. All right, next, Hezbollah made a public announcement that they're going to be siding with Assad. That's like waving a red flag in front of the Israelis. All right, and you go right down the line, then all of a sudden you realize that there already are a number of ex parte actors that are involved in the turmoil in Syria. So it almost stands to reason that, by definition, other countries are going to be involved. If this was, for example, the Russians versus the Chechens from 20 years ago, yeah, I mean, the West lamented the loss of life and all that. I mean, everybody was appropriately sad, but nobody seriously for 1 second thought that they were going to do anything.
Who was that American politician in Massachusetts who said all politics is local?
Tip
That's
O'Neill.
Tip O'Neill. I
Uh,
think actually under globalization, less and less politics is actually local, and there's more and more because of the amount of our interaction that is now remote. More and more of what goes on everywhere is influenced by in a larger arena of interaction that involves outside influences than ever before, and certainly no conflicts are local anymore.
well, and that's true because if you look at the causal link, I mean, look at a country like Niger, for example, sort of a backwater place, to put it mildly. I've never been. I mean, I suppose they do have some uranium deposits there. But now all of a sudden, it's a hot place, no pun intended, but it's a hot place geopolitically because of Islamic fundamentalism. All right, the idea of the fact that some vast square kilometers of desert sand could be used as a Islamic fundamentalist base that could be used to train, et cetera, like it'd be like Afghan deja vu. And it's been accorded far more importance, perhaps, than, I mean, 20 years ago, nobody would have paid attention.
But this is exactly the point that I think we need to make because of what's happened this past week, that you can no longer say that any particular part of the world is in the long term more significant than any other part of the world. I mean, I would have said last week that it all depends on the density of population.
Mm-hmm.
And where you've got most people, those are the places that are going to be the most important. But Niger has shown us that that isn't necessarily the case, because it's so easy to move.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So all of a sudden, places that you thought were insignificant can suddenly become very important.
But then it's a very unequal balance because you have on one end of the pipeline this very broad funnel of potential groups that can suddenly rise, cause the import level of a place like Niger to go from relatively unimportant to very important. And then on the other side of the pipeline, it explodes out into the international scene where everybody has to begin to get involved. I mean, the French have to get involved. Eventually, the Americans are already providing military assistance. I mean, where will that go? When will the Russians begin to pay attention? It's only a matter of time until the actual Arabs in North Africa begin to pay attention, especially with the Islamic connection. So it's almost as if, and I understand big events occur from small events, but it's almost as if a very small group of a finite number of people are able to put together a chain of causal events that one thing leads to another, and you end up with a situation where you may have a number of global actors that are involved in trying to arbitrate something in a place as remote as the South Central African desert.
Yes, one wonders all the time what the next meeting that's going to be important will be, and I think that the thing that we have to watch most in the next week is this relationship between Russia, Assad, Hezbollah, Israel, America, and Europe as it all meets in the Middle East, with knowing that Iran is playing, Saudi Arabia is playing, Turkey is playing as well.
Well, the Israelis have already told the Russians publicly that if those missiles are delivered, they will act.
That's what they've said. But at the same time, the leaders of America and China are meeting outside Los Angeles.
Yes. Yes.
So obviously more is going on than actually gets reported in the news that we read.
Well, one of the focal points of that discussion between the Chinese president and the American president is no doubt going to be the recent revelation by the American Defense Department that there is this organized effort by the Chinese military to break in and steal American sophisticated weapon designs.
yes, and I'm sure something like that is going on in the Middle East as well, since there are a lot of very clever computer hackers in the Middle East as well. No, it's becoming more and more difficult to keep up with actually what is going on that might be considered significant, partly because we're dependent on who gets which reporters get the space in the things that we read and what they know to begin with and what they know to look for.
Well, let me ask you a question. If you were President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov, what are you actually trying to do in Syria? I mean, considering that if you and I are sitting here and know that there's going to be an Israeli response, a European response, and an American response, I mean, what exactly are you trying to do?
The same as Kennedy was trying to do in Cuba in 1963, was it, or whenever it was?
So
I mean, look, these are just around the south of the Russian border. And Russia has watched Afghanistan taken away from it, and it can't control what goes on in Iran. It's lost Iraq, and it doesn't want to lose Syria.
So if perhaps the West approached the Russians and either assured them that there was no territorial or sphere of influence ambition, or perhaps some discussion about a post.
I mean, if everything was logical and people knew how to talk to each other, it's possible that there might be a way for them to come together and each see things in terms of their own interests. But you know, they have different table manners, and it's probably very difficult for Putin and Obama to talk to each other in such a way that they could come to a general agreement about how to compromise, make useful compromise on their interests. However, I think that it's a geopolitical problem that some people in the Middle East who are supporting Assad simply because they don't want yet another country in the Middle East to become dependent on America. And I'm not saying that it necessarily would become dependent on America anyway, because after all, who knows who's going to win if Assad loses?
Right. They could become dependent on Iran.
Well, if Assad loses, it's not likely to become dependent on Iran, but we never know.
Right.
We'll find out next week, maybe.
Well, we'll have to hold our breaths until then. All right, Brian, thank you very much. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.